Good afternoon, everyone. Of course, for the members of church, I think you have at least something to fill up your stomach. I hope that it will not put you to sleep afterwards. And usually after a heavy lunch, and then you continue on lecture, sometimes you will sleep. That's why we didn't give you a very heavy refreshment. But I think it's good enough to fill our stomach. Once again, I want to thank you for coming. We want to welcome some friends with us. I think some guests with us for the first time. We want to welcome all of you here. And I think we are here, we know we are here for one reason, okay? We want to hear from Dr. Seow, Dr. Seow Choon Leong. Just a very short introduction. Dr. Seow, he was actually born in Singapore, but was basically spent a lot of times actually in the States, in the studies, and then in the seminary. Right now, of course, he's lecturing there in some of the university, seminary. And also, he actually lectured in many parts of the world, in Hong Kong, South Africa, in Singapore, and of course, right now also in Malaysia. He's actually here for 3 months, I think, engaged with STM, local seminary in Seremban. And his expertise is actually in Old Testament, particularly I think wisdom literature, and also ancient Near East language. I was understand on that is his expertise. And this afternoon, actually, he will be talking on cosmology from the eyes, from God's perspective. Yeah, let's talk about God's eyes on cosmology. And without further delay, why not I just hand this time over to Dr. Seow, and let's put our hands together to welcome him.
Thank you, Reverend Leong. Thank you for coming. So this is the first of a series of 6 lectures. They are independent but connected. They're on the last part of the book of Job, which is also the most difficult part. The last part where God answers Job, and then you get Job's response, and an epilogue. And this is the most difficult part of the book of Job. But I thought since this is the first one, I will do a very brief, not introduction to the book, but sort of set in context the text that we're going to cover today. So we might first ask the question, what is Job? This seems like an easy answer. It's a biblical book. But that's only the most famous literary deposit. The story is also known through many iterations, including literature, over 3,000 pieces of visual art, music, from Gregorian chant to hip-hop and hard metal rock, drama, film, even dance, all of which willingly shape our perceptions of the book. Jews, Christians, and Muslims speak of the story of Job, but they have not all read the same book. For Christians, before the 16th century, the authoritative version was not the Hebrew, but the Greek, which is vastly different from the Hebrew. Job is also a literary theological classic, extolled as perhaps the greatest masterpiece of the human mind, says French scholar Victor Hugo, or the greatest poem of ancient and modern times, says Alfred Lord Tennyson, or the most wonderful poem of any age and language, or the most sublime monument in literature. It's also an exceedingly difficult book. The Christian scholar Jerome, after he translated Job from the Hebrew to Latin, says that Job is like a slippery murena, kind of eel. The more you try to grasp it, the more it slips away. What Jerome meant is that it's so difficult to pin down what exactly is said, because the metaphors, and sometimes there are multiple meanings. And it's difficult to pin down, and especially difficult to proclaim in the church. The Hebrew is by far the most difficult in the Bible. There are some 170 terms that do not occur elsewhere in Hebrew. So we can figure out what they mean only by looking at other related languages, Arabic, Akkadian, Syriac, and so forth. Also, the theological ideas in the book are often at variance from central tenets of Scripture, as you'll see in a little bit. But it is also theologically perhaps the most honest book of the Bible. So it's often called a classic, a literary theological classic. But what makes the classic? Well, longevity. Right? It's lasted thousands of years. It's universal appeal, translated in all languages, all over the world, and appealing to various people in various constituencies. Its timeliness is always timely. At every age, the message of Job seems to be relevant, or the questions at least seem to be relevant. Its profundity. You cannot get fully the meaning, the depth of the book, no matter how much. So I just finished the second volume of my commentary. The first volume was 999 pages, and now volume 2. And I'm not everything about, I don't get everything that the book's trying to convey. It's also well known for its aesthetic elegance, its literary, its poetic beauty. One of the most beautiful books on the Bible in terms of poetry. And it's a classic because it has the capacity to generate unending conversations. Even critiques and conflicting views become part and parcel of what the Job means. And when I started working on the book of Job, I was mostly interested in the philology, in the language, and the original meaning and the exegesis. And I realized that there were all these artworks around. I did not know what to do with them. There's poetry, there's literature, there's plays, so forth. And there's artwork around. I just did not know what to do with them because I couldn't read art. I flunked art in primary 1. So what am I going to do with all this artwork? So, well, I'm a scholar, I'll just include a few of them in the book just to be inclusive. I didn't know quite what to do with them. Then on a trip to Taiwan in 2003, I visited the National Museum in Taiwan. It housed the largest collection of landscape paintings anywhere in the world. And there you see paintings like these. Typically, Chinese painting, you see landscape painting, you will have a stamp, an epigram by the artist. But sometimes you get paintings with multiple stamps, with many writings. What I've learned since is that Chinese landscape paintings are never crowded. Artists always left room for reception. So all comments were made by different people through the ages. And sometimes there were conflicting comments. In Chinese landscape painting, the meaning does not reside in a recoverable original. The meaning of painting resides in the conversation that takes place. The painting encapsulates generations of conversation to which we are invited to participate. That was my aha moment. It changed my scholarship forever. Because henceforth, I can no longer read the Bible only in its voice original. I also had to pay attention to what happened to the Bible after it was completed. So I call this the history of consequences. And sometimes the consequences is what widely called reception history, how the Bible has been received. But I've argued that reception history is too passive a term. Because sometimes when the Bible is read a certain way, people die. We have stories in the book of Job of people who read the book of Job who went out to murder Jews. So those are consequences of Scripture. So consequences become part of how the text means. And no one can look at a painting and say, oh, I don't want to see the history, I just want the original. You cannot unsee history of conversation. So the book begins in a once upon a time fashion. The method of introduction here, there was a man, is found only twice in the Bible. One of them is concerning a parable. There were two men in a city. So this is not, so typically, the introduction of the Bible will have superscription, placing in context the book's history, historical context, and typically not always clear in translation. And it came to pass. It's always and. So all the stories that seem to be related, part of a nation's meta narrative. But the book of Job does not begin that way. It begins as if it's saying once upon a time. There was a man in the land of Uz. Uz is a place in northern Arabia, southern Edom. The arrow points to the site called Tamar. Tamar was an oasis in northern Arabia, I mentioned in the book of Job. So Uz is somewhere in northern Arabia. And there's some evidence for this too, because there's an old Arabian inscription found with the name Uz, in Arabic of a tribal name. So Job is set in the context of Transjordan, somewhere in Aram or in southern Jordan, near the place of Tamar. There was man in the land of Uz, and Job was his name. There's a slight emphasis here in Hebrew. It's not, there was a man in the land of Uz, and his name was Job, which is the normal way they would say it, and Job was his name, which means there's an emphasis on Job, the name. This is not a Hebrew name. No other person in Hebrew in the Bible or in inscriptions is called Job. Job's name probably meant something originally. Where is the Divine Father? Where is God? And we had comparable names in Akkadian, in the Transjordan, and so forth, in the second millennium. But the form of the name, as it stands right now in Hebrew, means something like enemy. Enemy, that is one who has experienced animosity. And here, this is a trope mentioned by Job several times. He has been treated like an enemy of God. God treats him as if he were an enemy. So the Jews pick this up. So Job, this trope of enmity with God, is one that we find several times in Job. So Job is in somewhere in the Transjordan. This is not a story about a chosen people, a covenant people, deliberately placed in Transjordan, so you cannot, it's not Israel. Job is everyone. Job is an everyone who has suffered for no known reason. So it starts off from that way. Once upon a time, there's this person who suffered for unknown reasons. Job is an everyone. And that man was, and there's four descriptors: blameless, just, a fearer of God, and one who turned from evil. That is, the first verse already says he's a paragon of virtue. Blameless, the word also means perfect, having full integrity, body integrity, he's personally whole. He's also just. He's socially good, ethical. Fearing God, that's a term throughout the ancient Near East for being religious. He was pious, and he was one who turned away from evil. He was morally good. No other person in the Old Testament is described this way. That is, Job is as perfect as a person can be. Job is as perfect as a person can be. That's the first verse. The second verse begins with and. Often lost in translation. And. Often lost in translation, but it's important. Something that means because he's so perfect, and so he has a perfectly good life. But that's not what it says. And. And is ambiguous. The reader is invited to consider whether or not there's correlation between verse 1, description of perfectly righteous Job, and verse 2, right, 2 to 4, a man with all his blessings. Are the two connected? Is he so blessed because he was so good? It's an open question. And it's actually very important. I have often thought someday I'm going to preach a sermon on and. And is important. And Job, as one Spanish scholar tells us, Job is not simply a book to be read, it's a book to be experienced. You read interactively, engaging it, challenging your own assumptions and your own theology. So he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. 7 sons is perfectly good family, blessed family. 7 sons and 3 daughters to boot. That's extraordinarily good. I know of only one character in ancient Near Eastern literature with 7 sons and 3 daughters, and that's a god. The god Baal Ugaritic. His property, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, 500 yokes of oxen, 500 she-asses. They're all round numbers. See? This is to suggest his life is perfectly good, he's perfectly blessed, he's a very great staff of servant, reputation, and a perfectly harmonious family. And the bottom here, you see a painting by William Blake with his family, all perfectly harmonious. On the right side, you see the sun setting and this Anglican church in the background. On the left, you see the sun is set, there's darkness, see, a warning of what's to come. So, starts with this perfectly good setting. Job was hyper-vigilant in piety. So his children all took turns to celebrate, each one his day for the sons. So 7 days a week, they partied. Each son had a day, so 7 days a week, they partied. And when they had completed their days of feasting, the full week, Job sent for and sanctified his children. He rose early in the morning, offered up burnt offerings according to the number of all of them, for he thought, perhaps my children have sinned and blessed God in their heart. Thus Job would do all the ways. That's why I said this morning, Job was kiasu. He has all his blessings, he's afraid to lose anything, so he's going to be perfectly good. Right? He doesn't just make offerings. He got up early in the morning, he offers for all of them. He thought perhaps his children might sin in their hearts and bless God in their hearts, so he would do all the days. Kiasu. Now you may notice a peculiarity, bless God in their hearts. That's because the Hebrew word there, barach, can be taken at face value, he blessed, or it can be euphemism, he blessed, which is to say, he cursed. He cursed. And it's ambiguous. 6 times this verb occurs in the prologue, and each time the reader must decide, is it blessed or is it blessed? So even putting the quotation mark is an interpretive move. It's me as an interpreter putting quotation marks. So I don't want to translate curse because that flattens the ambiguity. The text is ambiguous. And each time blessed occurs, the reader must decide, does it mean blessed or does it mean curse? So Job is this perfectly kiasu, righteous person. He does everything right, but life on earth is not determined only by people. Then one day, in the divine council, the prologue moves from earth to heaven, so forth. One day, God presides over the divine assembly, presides over the sons of gods, divine beings, gods. And there came also one called the adversary, not Satan, not a proper name Satan, the adversary, not Satan. Satan, in fact, in the Old Testament, is not a proper name. Satan became proper name only later. In the Old Testament, Satan is a common noun. Satan is any adversary, whether it's military, judicial, political, and one of an angelic intermediary who hinders the people of Transjordan. So it's a common noun. Then in the Persian period, you get this first mention of the Satan, the adversary, okay? A manifestation of doubt and judgment. So Yahweh then calls attention to the adversary and says, have you considered my servant Job? And Yahweh repeats what the narrator said. He's blameless, just, a fearer of God, and one who turns from evil. To which the adversary said, has Job feared God for naught? It's a very slight change in Hebrew. The adversary does not mention blameless, because one could see if Job is blameless. He does not mention if God is just. One could see from Job's action if he was just. He does not mention whether Job turns from evil. One can see. The one thing you cannot see is whether or not Job is fearer. The adversary also does not concede as God has said that Job is a fearer of God. In fact, the adversary, the slight change in pronunciation, says, has Job feared so far? So ignores all the others, zeroes in one thing, in the interiority of Job. Has Job feared God gratuitously, for no reason? This is, in fact, the key question in the book. The key question in the book is it possible for people to be pious for no reason? Do people worship God for no reason other than God is God? Or do we worship God conditionally, if God will behave as we think God should behave? So the challenge in the book of Job is raised by the adversary. Do people relate to God unconditionally, just as God relates to us unconditionally? Okay? Has Job feared God for not? So the adversary impugns the integrity of Job, but he also impugns the character of God. He says to God, have you put a hedge around him, a cactus fence, a fence around him, around his household, around all that he has? You have blessed his understanding, and his possessions burst forth throughout the earth. It's a little ironic that God built a fence and the blessings burst forth. Importantly, the expression put up a hedge is found elsewhere in Hosea 2, verse 8, of Gomer, who represents Israel, and Hosea, who represents God. So a fence is built around Gomer, who represents Israel, to prevent Gomer from straying. Right? In other words, God takes steps. God takes desperate steps to prevent Israel from going astray. Despite all the blessings that Israel received, God seemed to have to take drastic measures to secure human love. So the adversary now implies that the beneficent nature of divine blessing may in fact be reflect God's insecurity about human love. God wants to make sure we love them, so God gives us blessings. That's the implication of the usage. Bless his understanding. This language echoes Deuteronomy. Okay? It echoes the promise of divine blessing as a reward for fidelity. But the adversary is now challenging this Deuteronomistic theology, where he questions if God's blessing is really a reward for fidelity, or is it really a bribe to secure human allegiance, to secure human love? Did you just bribe human beings to love you? So it's a theological problem that the book is posing. So the adversary, but stretch out your hand and strike all that belongs to him. He will surely bless you to the face. Bless you here, meaning euphemistic sense. Stretch out your hand, God, and strike all that he has. He will surely bless you, curse you to your face. That is directly. Japanese sculptor Goro Kake in 1961 produced this sculpture for an Episcopal high school. There's Job in the middle, as a little Episcopal schoolboy, facing Satan in front of him. Satan has a huge left hand stuck out. The left hand, in many cultures, is somewhat sinister, right? Somewhat sinister. But in Japanese culture, the left hand is power. Yeah, power. Behind him is a figure looking like Godzilla, figure of God. And God is doing this. And there's communication between God and Satan, and Job is oblivious to it. So I had a former student of mine who belonged to a family of scholars who knew the artist. So they sent me pictures from different angles. And from another angle, you see Job without a left hand. Job is powerless. And God is doing this. And Satan is doing this. What's going on there? What is Kake trying to suggest? They are playing rock, paper, scissors. Singapore we call lom jam pas. Rock, paper, scissors. And God is scissors to Satan's paper. Kake's point is that here we have God playing a silly, childish game. Rock, paper, scissors is a game invented by Japanese. Playing a silly, childish game in which an innocent person is hurt. What kind of God is that? I think Kake captures something of the problem of the book of Job. Here, all he has is in your hand, God says to the adversary. Interpreters struggle with this. God just turns over Job to the hand of the adversary. The theological problem then is followed by a series of stylized, almost cartoonish reports of disasters coming one after the other. First, the Sabaeans came. Sabaeans are folks from there are three places in the Old Testament named called Sabah or Shavah. The original Sabah is in Yemen, present-day Yemen. But the Sabaeans were great traders, and so they established a colony on the east coast of Africa, when came the Queen of Sheba, Sabah. So the second Sabah. The third Sabah is in northern Arabia, precisely near the oasis of Tamar. This must be the Sabah that is mentioned in the book of Job. This Sabah did not exist until the 8th century, until about 700 BCE, which means Job could not have been written before 700 BCE. So the Sabaeans came, the raiders came, and destroyed Job's property, followed by a divine fire that fell from heaven and destroyed Job's property. This is followed by Chaldeans. Chaldeans can describe the army of Nebuchadnezzar, imperial army of Nebuchadnezzar. But Sabaeans in the book of Job are not an imperial army. They seem rather to be ragtag raiders, raiders who are launching attacks against local people. We know of the Chaldeans behaving this way only one other time, between 553 and 543 BCE. The Chaldeans followed a Babylonian king who was exiled to the oasis town of Tamar, which means Job must be dated no earlier than the mid-6th century. So the Sabaeans attack, divine fire, Chaldeans attack, and then followed by a great wind. The acts of God and acts of human work in tandem to destroy Job. One important detail is lost in translation. Most translations say a great wind came and struck the house of Job's firstborn. That is, the wind came and the wind struck the house of Job's firstborn. But the Hebrew word for wind is feminine. The word for strike is masculine. And the word wind is feminine in this very passage. Which means the point is not that the wind struck the house, it is he struck the house. Who is he? Well, this word strike goes back to verse 11, where the adversary tells Yahweh to strike all that he has, and now he has struck. So the book of Job in the Hebrew is scarier than our translation lets on. So it highlights the third problem, a God who's involved in hurting an individual soul. But Job remains steadfast. Job arose, so in the previous section, the Chaldeans came and they fell on Job. The Sabaeans came and they fell on Job. Fell. And now Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell. And at the last minute, worship. He didn't just die, he worshiped, saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. It says, I will return there. Yahweh gave, Yahweh took away, blessed be the name of Yahweh. Despite the literary setting that placed Job in the Transjordan, that perhaps implies that Job is not an Israelite, Job is nevertheless a Yahwist, worshipper of Yahwist. Then it says, in all this, Job did not sin and did not ascribe offense to God. So that's the first test, round one. Job passed, he was steadfast. The second test repeats the same. Same thing happened. The assembly gathered again, and this time there's an addition. Then Yahweh said to the adversary, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on earth, a man blameless and just, a fear of God, wanders him from evil." And God adds, he still holds fast to integrity. Integrity is blamelessness, wholeness. Although you incited me, in the Hebrew there's a word play, you satan me, or you satanized me. You satan me against him to destroy him for naught. Startling, right? In the first chapter, first play, do people worship God for no reason? Do we worship God, a God who hurt somebody for no reason? Therefore, no reason is important. Do people worship God for no reason? Even such a God? Even a God who participates in harming individuals for no reason. So it's a theological problem. Then, so God tells the adversary to go ahead and with what he's again gives Job the hand of the adversary, and he, presumably the adversary, afflicted Job with terrible information from the sole of his feet up to his crown. I put this in different colors because the combination of words occurs only one other time in the Bible. Only one other time in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 28, verse 35. It's a chapter that describes covenant curses. These are curses that are laid on sinners. People who disobey God deliberately will be cursed. See, Yahweh will afflict you on the knees and legs with terrible inflammation from which you will not be able to recover, from the sole of your foot to the crown of your head. In other words, Job is made to look like a sinner. He's made to look like a sinner, even though the reader knows. He has been told he's done nothing. He's made to look like a sinner, as is said in the Bible. The adversary then disappears. Despite the reception history, where the adversary is a major figure, the adversary is actually a minor figure in the story. It's there for a purpose. The adversary disappears from the scene at this point. So we have two assemblies. The first assembly produced the first test. Job has lost all his possessions, and yet the result is that Job, in all this, did not sin, did not ascribe offense to God, 122. The second assembly, Job's body is afflicted. See, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Has something changed now that he's personally afflicted? Jews and Christians read Job differently. Christians read Job as a type of Christ, as a model for Christians. Jews and Christians read Job the same way until 220 AD. Because Christians took Job as an antitype of Christ, Jews said, you can have him. He's a troublemaker and a blasphemer. So the Targum, the Aramaic translation, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips, but in his heart he did. His heart did. So the Jewish translation caught the ambiguity. He doesn't with his lips. But this again raises the problem. The prologue leaves no doubt that the afflictions of Job have nothing to do with whether Job has sinned or not. Right? It's mentioned in verse 1, and God repeats it. The narrator attests to Job's character at the outset. God corroborates it twice in 1:8 and 2:3. The second time, God even admits to have destroyed Job for naught. The decision to harm Job, according to the narrator, takes place in a divine assembly, which we call Psalm 82, where God presides over the divine council, all the other gods, and God judges all the other gods. Right? And if they have not done justice, they get thrown out. They get thrown out of heaven and cease to become God and die like mortals. The gods are supposed to ensure justice, and Yahweh above all presides over all the other gods to make sure they do justice. If not, they get thrown out. And yet we have this chapter where God presides over the divine council, and Job is hurt under God's oversight. That's the problem laid out in the prologue. Job is made to look like someone who, according to Deuteronomy, was being punished for sin, even though we know he has not sinned. And yet the reader knows that the reader knows more than the interlocutors. The reader knows more than Job, more than his friends, that Job's suffering was for naught. That's the problem. No other biblical book lays out the problem of divine injustice in such stark terms. That's the prologue. So Job has been patient, steadfast, right? And all of a sudden, in 3:1, he cursed. Right? The book of James says, "You have heard of the patience of Job." How many of you have heard of the patience of Job? So there are 42 chapters in the book of Job. In how many chapters is Job patient? All of 2. Job's patient. Chapter 3, Job cursed. His day. A sharp contrast. So the poem now complicates the narrative. Sharp contrast with the posture of Job in the prologue, patient Job. Now you get an angry Job. The chapter begins with Job's counter-cosmic rant. He curses creation. He casts himself as man, a representative of humankind, and he calls for darkness, counterintuitively calls for darkness and chaos to triumph, because God has not kept man from suffering. So because human beings suffer, Job says you might as well not have creation. And there are many, many ambiguities in this poem, because Job seems to curse creation, but sometimes one wonders if there's more than meets the eye. Is he being blasphemous? The vitriol in this chapter has shocked interpreters. Jews saw this chapter as evidence of Job's rebellion, even his blasphemy. Christian interpreters were especially troubled by Job's harsh rhetoric, because Job seems to curse God's creation and blames God. And so Christians read difficult parts of the book of Job allegorically. Job didn't really curse creation, he meant to curse death, because Job is about God redeeming us from death. So Christians softened the message, suggest that Job was cursing not creation, but the problem of death, which God will overcome. In the early modern period, when Christians began discovering the Hebrew text, Christian interpreters defended blasphemy as an appropriate human response. Jews had long thought this. Sometimes people suffer so much, right? Whatever they say cannot be held against them. During the Holocaust, Jewish philosophers defended Jewish anger against God for the death of the Jews, because people in suffering, people who suffer that much, cannot be blamed for their anger against God. So chapter 3 now complicates the story, right? It's not rosy. Now you get human being responding in great anger. Then you get this debate, chapter 3 to 31, this whole debate between Job and his friends. Again, Job and his friends, 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and so far, debate the question of divine justice in the case of Job, without any awareness of what's taking place in the prologue. Right? We know what they do, what happened in the prologue, the deal that God had made with the adversary. The reader knows what the humans do not, that Job has done nothing wrong. The friends have tradition. So Christians and Jews, again, read Job differently. For Christians, Job represented Christ, and so the friends, since they opposed Job, were heretics. So Christians read the book of systematic theology, and the friends all are heretics. Jews read all the speakers as offering viable explanation. So in commentaries, you typically find interpreters condemning Job's friends for being shallow. But the friends have tradition on their side. Their tradition on their side, they hold the default view throughout the ancient world that there's no such thing as a sinless person. Every human being sin. No one is perfect. So Job, why are you being angry? Don't blame God. Ask yourself what you've done wrong. This is the dominant tradition. It makes sense. Moreover, Job has been stricken with terrible sores, just as Torah has said. Right? And he has cried out against creation. He has blamed God for imperfect creation. In short, Job looks like a sinner, and he talks like a sinner. So he must be a sinner. So you can't blame the friends. See, they're trying to help Job get away from suffering to be better. Job's hyper-vigilant piety in chapter 1 indicates his own awareness of the traditional view. Okay? Piety brings blessings, sin brings punishment. Job assumed that, you can tell in chapter 1 tells us that. So Job assumes he's being punished. But he does not know for what. There's no charge laid against him. He's being punished, but for no reason, and kept demanding, give me the charge, tell me what have I done wrong. I might have done wrong, what have I done wrong? And if I've done wrong, how is it so egregious it will hurt you? See, what burden has it been on you? He asks. Okay? So the friends hear this and they judge from their point of view. The reader has the advantage of knowing the larger picture. So Job contends, God must be unjust. His own experience tells him, God must be unjust. The friends tell him, you cannot count on yourself, you must count on tradition. What's objective? As opposed to your personal experience. And Job says, you can't discount my experience. Right? My suffering is my suffering. I experience it. You can't tell me that I don't matter. So it poses the question of objectivity and subjectivity in understanding theology. So Job then begins an important legal metaphor. In chapter 4 and 5, in the first speech, Eliphaz lays out the theory. He argues with tradition, no one can be righteous before God, because all have sinned. There's no such thing as a righteous person. Even the servants of God in heaven fall short. So don't be so sure, Job, that it's not your sin. Right? Can a human be right before God? Well, Job, thinking about this, responded, the question is whether or not we are right before God is moot, because is there any way I can prove I'm right? So Job initiates a legal metaphor. But how can a mortal be right with God? In other words, how can a human be right with God in a lawsuit? As he makes clear in verse 3. If this were a law court, I can prove I'm right. He's very sure if he has a chance, he can prove he's right. Because otherwise, you just can't say you can't be right before God. Where's the proof? And so, chapter 9 and 10, this one speech, introduces this legal metaphor. Okay? This legal metaphor of objectivity, which is sustained through his speeches. God can do whatever. Job complains, God is totally free, can do whatever God wants, and if God takes away something illegally, who's to tell him, give it back? Who can hold God accountable? God has all the power and wisdom and allies, and no one can see God. So how can I prove them innocent? That's a major theme. So he insists that there can be no justice unless there can be direct encounter with God. So he looks everywhere. Chapter 3 says, I look everywhere. He looks east and west, north and south. But God is nowhere to be found. Notice this echoes Psalm 139, where the psalmist says, you go east, west, north, south, and everywhere God is. Instead of God being omniscient, omnipresent everywhere, Job argues that God is omniabsent, absent everywhere. God is nowhere to be found, no one can see God, which is true. See, in other words, Job is challenging the tradition. Don't just go around saying God's everywhere. I look for God everywhere, but nowhere to be found. Job's legal metaphor will continue until chapter 31, the climax of the wisdom dialogue. At the end of chapter 31, Job lays out, in chapter 29, talks about his previous life. Everything was wonderful. He was perfectly blessed. And then for no reason, chapter 30, God takes away everything and reverses everything. No reason whatsoever, except that he must be a cruel God. Chapter 31 then says he goes through a list of possible offenses. With Job arguing that he's not done anything. He's not done anything he knows of that's wrong. So having laid out this in a legal form, he demands, let Shaddai answer me. Let the man of my disputation, he calls God, my legal disputant answer me, he declares. But God does not answer him immediately. So chapter 31 then leads us to expect God's response. But God does not answer Job for another 6 chapters. Then comes young Elihu. Elihu, chapter 32 to 37 consists of a series of speeches by a young man named Elihu, son of Barachel. Elihu has not been treated well by scholars. Most scholars think he's this pompous young upstart, has plenty to say, but nothing original. He's simply mouthing orthodox views. He's like this young professor, newly minted PhD, comes to the department and thinks all the old guys know nothing. He's going to teach them. So scholars don't like Elihu. I think all of Elihu's speech should be eliminated. That this is inserted secondarily by an editor. But I will argue, young Elihu comes in the right spot. Young Elihu comes after the wisdom dialogue in 331 has failed. So like young Joseph, who came after all the wise men, have failed to interpret the dream for Pharaoh, Joseph came, and though he was young, he succeeded because the Spirit of God was with him. He's like young Daniel, who came after all the experts have failed to interpret Belshazzar's dream, Nebuchadnezzar, because the Spirit of God is in him. So Elihu comes at the right place. Elihu represents the Elitic tradition. There are 2 traditions in the Old Testament. One is after God, who's called El. El is a high God, transcendent God, creator God, remote. El is a prevalent tradition in the north, where you have the name Israel, Beth El, folks know Samuel. El communicates with human beings by way of intermediaries, prophets, and through dreams and vision. Whereas in Southern tradition, revelation is direct. So Elihu represents this northern tradition, where revelation came through intermediaries and by way of dreams and visions. In fact, Elihu presents himself as one who's been inspired by divine spirit, as something of a prophet, an intermediary. Elihu, in fact, offers new insights regarding the problem of human suffering. He argues that suffering is not always about punishment. Sometimes there are other reasons for suffering. God's trying to teach us something, or sometimes there's no explanation, right? But it's not always about sin. And yet, Elihu somehow falls short at the end. He tries to defend the justice of God, but he's simply able to show that God is not unjust. Then in his final speech, having realized that he's not proven his point, he turns to the image of God as a teacher, God who teaches human beings lessons by way of tempest. The song this morning, How Great Thou Art, is inspired by the hymn in chapter 37. God is great. See, we hear his rolling thunder, but we do not know the mysteries of God. Elihu, whose name in Hebrew is written as if he could be pronounced as Elijah, prepares the way for Yahweh's coming. Okay, so all of this is to prepare us for a section of Yahweh's response. Then it says, in 38:1, then Yahweh answered Job out of a storm wind. So Job has framed his challenge of God in legal terms. Yahweh's response, Yahweh's answer now comes out of a wind. Wind is a common metaphor for what is not rational, what is non-rational, unpredictable, even dangerous. So God doesn't respond to Job the way Job wants in legal terms, but rather by way of storm wind. The Hebrew term for storm wind is commonly used for divine manifestation. In fact, the Hebrew says literally, the storm wind. Yahweh responds to Job by out of the storm wind, as if the reader ought to know what storm wind is meant. In fact, Job has used this very term, storm wind, in chapter 9, suggesting that God has hurt him by a storm wind, or as a storm wind, which recalls the wind that destroyed the house of his born and all his children. The Aramaic Targum, the version, therefore speaks of Yahweh answers Job out of the storm wind of suffering. Other rabbis suggested the same God who hurt Job through a storm wind now heals him through a storm wind. Early Christian interpreters as well regarded God's manifestation as an act of grace. Okay? As an act of grace. Because Elihu's answer has been inadequate, God reveals himself to Job. God's revelation is a deliberate outreach to the desperate mortals who need an answer. And in Christian art, you see typically image here on the left side of a hand reaching out from heaven to Job. It's an outreach, a surprising outreach. On the right side, you get God revealing to Job, and God is in the mandala, which is typically used to represent Christ. And God here is represented as Christ. You see it in the back, in his halo, there's a cross. Right? In art history, that's called the Christ Logos. So God reveals himself as the Christ Logos. In other words, human beings know God only through Christ, who represents God. So Christians saw this as a manifestation of God's grace. God doesn't have to respond to Job, but God does, and that is an act of grace. Importantly, the text says, and Yahweh answered Job. This is in contrast to all the other superscriptions. Each speech is introduced, so-and-so answered and said. So-and-so answered and said. Suddenly now, God answered Job, not the friends. The friends' issue is retribution, and we'll come to that, but Job's issue was governance of the world and justice. So God answers Job. I want to stress this because very commonly, interpreters say God really doesn't answer Job. God bullies Job. God bullies Job. I know stuff you don't, so shut up. Right? So is God answering? But the text says God answered Job, and that's our struggle. How has God answered Job? Twice God answers Job in 38, 39, introduced by 38, 2 to 3. And in 40, 41, a second speech introduced by 40, 7 to 8. I juxtapose these two because they seem structurally related. So that the first, what's different is that the first speech revolves around the issue of Etzah. I'll come to this. And the second issue revolves around Mishpat. So the first speech is about Etzah. What is Etzah? Etzah is used in the Old Testament for counsel, assembly, or counsel, advice, wisdom. It's also plan, intention, or purpose. So what is Etzah in this speech? Well, interpreters suggest Etzah is God's counsel, God's advice regarding suffering. Or some scholars say it is God's providence in nature and history, or God's plan of action in history, or one scholar puts it, a grand design for how the universe should be structured and managed. So God asked Job, who is this who darkens my Etzah? This Etzah harks back to chapter 3, verse 30 to 10, where Job presents himself as man and calls for darkness and chaos to triumph over light and darkness. So Job has made God's creation, God's plan, darkness, has darkness God's plan. Later on in chapter 9, Job mimics doxology. The friends say the proper response to Job is to praise God. And Job uses the form of a praise to say the opposite. This is a God who does all these terrible things, and just brings earthquake and so forth. So Job again, in chapter 9, darkens God's intention. But especially chapter 12, another anti-doxology appears in a form of praise, but to make the opposite point. And there Job insists that God is the one who has all the wherewithal, including Etzah, wisdom, intention, design. God has all it takes to govern the cosmos, but the world is a mess. there's injustice in the world is turned upside down, so God is not governing the world as God should. So when God says, who is this who darkens my Itzah? God refers to all these challenges of Job about God's intention. What is Itzah? Job uses this term for God's oversight. God's oversight, God's intention in governance of the cosmos, though Job's point is that it is absent, though it should be present. And this problem of God's missing Itzah is known to nature. Just as the animals of the earth, the fish of the sea, and the birds of the sky. Which of these do not know that God has the wherewithal to govern the cosmos? But look at the world. Ask, and they, these creatures, will teach you. They will declare to you, who among these does not know? So this is Job's challenge, chapter 12. Now Yahweh's response, I will ask, and you will let me know. The entire speech in chapter 39 and 39 is didactic style. It's God's teaching, and we get recurrence of wisdom terms to know, to understand, to perceive. And God teaches by asking questions. Typical wisdom style. The speech, chapter 39 to 39, comes in three parts, three poetic movements. The first concerns cosmology, the second meteorology, and the third zoology. Today, we're going to have time only to do the first one. Okay. The first movement, verses 4 to 18, concerns creation of the earth, the sea, heaven. These are three elements that Job has mentioned, but also the netherworld, which Job has not mentioned. Right? So in the ancient world, the cosmos has four dimensions: earth, sea, heaven, and underworld. Earth is the length of the cosmos, sea is the breadth of the cosmos, heaven the heights, depth, netherworld the depth. Vertical axis, horizontal axis. So the speech begins in verse 4, where Job is challenged to declare if he knows. It ends in verse 18, where he speaks of declaring and knowing. So the speech is framed. The speech is framed, and the last end of the speech, all of it. That means not just partial, earth, sea, and heaven, but also netherworld, which is not talked about. You don't know all of it. So it's not that Job knows nothing. The problem is that Job does not know everything. The first stanza is about earth. Where were you when I founded the earth? Declare if you know understanding. And then God talks about determining the dimensions, stretching a line over it, as footings are sunk, and laid the foundation, the cornerstone, the first stone in a building. These are terms of civil engineering. Right? So since these are terms of civil engineering, there is the construction of the creation of the cosmos is expressed as a building construction. So Itzah, given that's the point, Itzah must mean something like plan or design. Right? Plan or design. So here we get the image of God as builder. Commentators note that there's a dearth of parallels in ancient literature for the idea of God as builder, except for the Babylonian creation epic, where Marduk, the god of Babylon, constructs his own temple, his abode. The image of God as a builder, one scholar has pointed out, is exceptional in the Bible. The Bible does not use the word bana to build, to speak of God creation. In fact, there is. Bana is used of the creation of woman. God created woman is bana. Very strange. So interpreters wonder, why did God use this term? God does not describe creation of a man in this term, but why does God use this building term to refer to woman? The famous medieval interpreter Rashi says, it's because women have large bottoms. I'm going to tell Mrs. Rashi, you said that. Rather, bana is used because it's related to children. Women, Martin Luther also looked at this. He said, no, women are constructed as building because they're like the foundation of the building. Luther was surprisingly feminist. See, women are the foundation of the family. But there are in fact two passages of Yahweh as a builder the scholars have overlooked, in my view. And I still think we must consider temple building as a metaphor for creation. The first passage is Psalm 78:69. God has built his sanctuary like the heights, that is the heavens, like the earth which is founded. So here's a metaphor of God as builder of a temple. The second passage is lost. It says in Amos 9:6, Yahweh who built in heaven his steps, ma'alot, his bond he founded on earth. This is lost because in translations, most translators take ma'alot to mean upper chambers. Who has built in the upper chambers in heaven? And the second word is translated as vault. These terms do not mean what commentators say it means. Okay? Who has built in heaven his steps, his bond on earth? This refers to the ziggurat, the Sumerian step temple. The Sumerians were dwellers of the plain. In the ancient world, the gods were understood to live in the mountains. And so if you live in the plains, how do you reach God? Well, you build a mountain. See? So the mountain is built, steps going up. This is the background of Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, with a top in heaven, which is a common metaphor, a common expression for a temple in Sumer and Babylon, and its roots deep in the underworld. So a step. It's also the background for so-called Jacob's ladder, which is not ladder, it means a step temple. Right? So the temple represents the vertical axis of the cosmos. Its root is deep in heaven, its top reaches the heaven. So what Amos is saying, is that who has built in heaven his steps, the ziggurat, the bond. The temple is often called the bond that links heaven and earth. The most famous temple builder is a guy named Gudea, who was a ruler of the site of Lagash in southern Iraq. There are hundreds of inscriptions about Gudea as builder. There are two versions of the project. The first is on statues, a prose version. In this version, Gudea drew a plan, to build a temple, and he organized it because he says, I'm brilliant. And here we have a statue with Gudea's laptop. He's got a city plan with his stylus and a ruler. See? So this is his plan, and he's built a temple according to his plan. Then you get a poetry version in two clay cylinders. In this version, the plan was conceived in heaven, the blueprint is in heaven. Gudea was chosen to build it because he was extremely brilliant, and the plan was revealed to him in a dream. In this version, the decree was made by the gods. He was selected because of his intelligence. The plan was revealed in a dream, and the temple was like a mountain, but also a tree. The building of the temple is like the growth of a tree. Its top reaches the heaven, which is An in Sumerian. Its root deep in the underworld, Ki. An-Ki in Sumerian means heaven, earth, the universe. It is a bond linking heaven and earth. It represents the vertical axis of the universe. Its construction is an earthly reenactment of creation. The human builder is counterpart of a celestial builder. As soon as foundation is laid, abundance came. Water came forth, water from above and from below, to benefit humankind, beginning with the city of Sumer, for all Sumer and all of humanity. The temple is built with timber brought from the north, where the gods are said to dwell. And the temple is a verdant spectacle. The temple is a veritable green tree, built there for wonder. So in Sumerian art, you often find a stylized mountain and a tree on top. See? This represents the vertical axis of the cosmos. Right? So, as soon as the temple was built, there was celebration. So, verse 7, when the morning stars cheered, as soon as the temple was founded, and the stars of morning cheered. This verse had very little impact in popular culture until the 17th century, because it was known originally in the West through the translation of Jerome in the Vulgate. Jerome tried, when the morning stars lauded me together. Lauded is not a very poetic term. So this was followed by Protestant translations until the end of 16th century. Then, in 1611, the King James Version translates, when the morning stars sang. This one word, sang, which is not what the Hebrew word means. The Hebrew word sang transformed this verse. Suddenly, Milton, in 1629, quoting the King James Version in his first poem, on the morning of Christ's nativity, such music, as it said, before was never made. When of old the sons of morning sung, when the Creator great. So Milton was inspired by this. The constellation set, the well-balanced world on hinges hung, and cast the dark foundations deep, the weltering waves their oozy channel keep. So Milton transformed this verse to put into poetry. And he speaks frequently of the celestial choir. Divided light, the day, darkness, night. It was the first day, even and morn. The celestial choir, when orient light, exhaling first from darkness, they beheld the birthday of heaven and earth. So this became very popular. So now, in sacred music, okay, scholars claim that sacred music was invented in the Garden of Eden when the world was formed. And this, Milton then transformed this in poetry, which inspired Friedrich Schiller's Under Freude, which inspired Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which inspired Henry van Dyke's translation. All thy works rejoice around thee, earth and heaven reflect thy ray, stars and angels sing around thee, centers of unbroken praise. So this becomes poetry, even though it had not been before 17th century. You get poetry composed, the stars sang in their spheres, like the voice of the stars. You find all this all over the place. The rhapsody of the morning stars. The morning stars that sweetly sang together. So poetry generated after Milton, who made it sublime poetry. When Milton spoke of the first morn, he was following the Greek version and the Syriac. Following this view, Francis Bacon popularized the expression, since the morning stars sang, which was an idiom of unsurpassed antiquity. Martin Luther King frequently ended his sermons by quoting this verse. The stars, morning stars, will sing at the end time, and the sons of God will shout for joy. C.S. Lewis, the magician's nephew, Aslan, brought Narnia into existence by singing. All this based on one word in the King James Version. In politics, we have the impact too. Woodrow Wilson, following World War I, urging the Treaty of Paris, preached a sermon in Alabama in which he argues that the signers of the Treaty of Paris were forging the hinges, laying the foundations, alluding to Milton, unlocking the hidden springs from which ceaseless fountains are to flow, the daybreak of a new creation. So Woodrow Wilson portrays the signing of the Treaty of Paris as a new creation. Lyndon Johnson, much less poetic, appealed for control of nuclear weapons, solely claiming that this is a prophecy for world peace, solely based on one word, together. The morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shout for joy. So we must all work together to end nuclear war. Of course, you get lots of music, but not before the King James Version. That one word changed everything. So the second stanza then is sea. He shut the sea with doors when it gushes forth. From the womb it departs. When I made the clouds its clothing, The nimbus, the dark cloud, is swaddling cloth. Then I established my limit upon it. I set doors, bars and doors. Thus far you shall come, and no further, and here the surge of your waves will be stayed. So the chaotic waters in the ancient world, in cosmology, in the cultural environment of ancient Israel, that's ancient Near East, the world was not created out of nothing. The world was not created ex nihilo. There was no creation ex nihilo until the 3rd century AD. So in the ancient world, the world was not created out of nothing. Creation was essentially establishing order out of chaos. The world existed already, but it was formless, it was vacuous and void. And out of that chaos, God established order. So creation was really the establishment of order out of chaos, as Genesis 1 has it. In biblical cosmology, the world is thought to be surrounded by water. Water above and water beneath, and the world is like a bubble. Right? God keeps the bubble to prevent the waters from coming down. Unless God's really angry, then God opens the window of heaven and you get a flood. And unclogged heaven, you get a flood. Right? But the world is like a bubble that God sustains, keeps chaos at bay. Notice, creation is not one for all. Chaos constantly is a threat. Evil is persistent, and God has to constantly keep the waters out. So creation is depicted as the establishment of order. And God, in many texts, imposes limits, boundaries on the waters. The rain clouds are also kept bound. See? So the clouds are like skin bags that are ready to burst. Right? And then God bundles up the waters as with garments. This is in accord with the broader cultural environment. In Babylonian creation myth, again the problem was chaos. Chaos, and so deep, the ocean needed to be contained. See, the folks in the ancient Near East were landlubbers. They were terrified of waters. So you stand at the coast of Israel, you see the waves coming in. The waves are constantly trying to swallow up the earth. See, it's only God keeping the waters at bay. So the god of Babylon is a champion who fights the forces of chaos, the sea monsters. He defeats the monsters and kills her, sets a limit to the sea. This is the creation of myth. So that's the background. How has God answered Job? This passage harks back to Job's initial outburst in chapter 3. And he shut, in verse 7, repeats, and he shut, in 3:23. God, in 3:23, Job says, God has shut me. God has unjustly shut me off and confined me. Now God answers Job. Job has characterized his outburst in terms reminiscent of the raging of unruly waters. So now Yahweh asserts God's purpose as regards the control of the sea, perhaps with Job in mind, because the idiom of the shutting of the sea, shutting of the double doors, echoes, in verse 8, echoes Job claiming that human beings are not shut out by double doors, reference to the woman's genitalia. Job complains of being alive. Job wishes he had never been born. Human beings are born and they suffer. And Job, I wish he'd never been born, just let me die. Not only God allows him to come forth from the womb, God nurtures him, keeps him alive, and which is why he suffers. So now the poet points to God's care of infancy. This enfant terrible, terrible infant, God provides this terrible infant with a cloud as his swaddling cloth, the dark cloud as his swaddling cloth, symbols of care and restraint. You think you are chaos, that's why I contain you. So it speaks of the shutting of sea, the limit, and the bars, all in accord with the cultural environment of ancient Israel. And then and the surge, which is also a word for the pride, the height of the waves will be stayed. This harks back to Psalm 89. And so Yahweh, the God of hosts, celestial, the stars represent the divine assembly. And the psalmist sings, "You, God, rule, govern over the height, the surge, the pride of sea. When its waves rise, you shut them." So throughout, in the hymnic text of the Bible, we celebrate God's containment of chaotic waters. So the pride, the height of the waves will be stayed. And the verb stay is used in Canaanite mythology for the suppression of sea. But it's also a closural term. Stay, stop, the stanza ends. Verse 11, though, is again a famous text with reception history. "Thus far we shall come, and no further." Back already in the 1st century, First Clement, addressing the church in Corinth, where there was a power struggle, urged the Christians not to struggle for power. They warned against Christians, each of us has our own place, see, right, in God's order. So do not try to claim more power than you should. Thus far you shall come, and no further. So the text known as Apostolic Constitution, again, is a warning against ecclesiastical ambition. Don't try to jostle to be bishop. See, thus far you shall come, and no further. In the 12th century, English historian William of Newburgh says God will stop the Muslims at the Battle of Tours. The Muslims are invading France, but at Tours, there's a prophecy, says William, that God will turn back the Muslims, for thus far shall come and no further. Martin Luther says God will stop the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, from coming to Europe. They cannot attack Germany. For God says, thus far shall come and no further. All this to say, the Bible doesn't just mean what it meant originally, we make it mean different things. Louisa of Prussia says, God will stop Napoleon, so he cannot conquer Germany. Thus far he shall come and no further. Lyndon Johnson, again, God will stop the communists in Southeast Asia. Thus far he shall come and no further. Vietnam. Rush Limbaugh, right-wing radio host, God will stop the waves of immigrants from Latin America, for thus far shall come and no further. Consequences of Scripture. Of course, in Netherlands, it's an important theme, right? Because Netherlands always in danger of being inundated by the floods. But God keeps the waves at bay. Thus far shall come and no further. The shore stand firm. So you get creation of earth, of sea, length and breadth of the cosmos, and now the heavens. Have you ever commanded morning star, made dawn to know its place, taken extremities of the earth, so that the reprobates, venal, are removed? The hosts of heaven are turned over like clay. The background, so I suggested earlier, the creation myth, sea is contained. In that same myth, after sea is contained, the hosts of heaven are given their appointed place, fixed places of the stars. The stars represent the gods, and they all have their places, their set patterns, they're not to transgress. The stars are held together by a network of bonds. The celestial hosts represent the divine assembly. In Canaan, there was a myth of astral deities, dawn and dusk, the morning star and the twilight stars. They are fixed position. The stars had their fixed places. And you get myths of gods who try to claim a superior place, but they're not able to do so. We find this in the Bible, in Isaiah 14, which speaks of the rebellious astral deities who did not know their fixed place. So Isaiah issues a taunt of the Assyrian king who dared to challenge Yahweh in Jerusalem. So Isaiah, citing an ancient hymn, "How you are fallen from heaven, an astral deity, O Halel." Halel is morning, day star, luminary, later on translated as Lucifer. Halel, morning star, son of dawn. But you'll be cut down to the earth, you who laid the nations low. So you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of El. So the Assyrian king thinks he can rise above the stars and challenge Yahweh. But Yahweh will destroy him, cast him down to earth, even as the stars are cast on earth. See, so they look at the stars and they see comets, shooting stars, and imagine the stars are being cast from heaven because they rebelled. So that's the background. We find that also in Daniel 8. In Daniel 8, it describes Antiochus Epiphanes, this mad king who came to Jerusalem and desacralized the temple. And Daniel says he's like this guy who imagines he can challenge God. See, right? Challenge God in heaven and throw down the stars. But he'll be thrown down like a fallen astral deity. So that is the third dimension, third dimension of the cosmos. Okay. So these rebels, the astral deity, will be removed, cast down, and become like mortals. So the final one, it's called the netherworld. Have you come as far as the sources of the sea? Have you walked about in the recesses of the deep? These terms refer to the abode of God in Mount Amanus in the north in Syria, which are called source of the two rivers, headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. And that's where the gods dwell, at the spring of the double deep, Tigris and Euphrates, the confluence of the double deep. So these are terms used of where the gods dwell. Okay. But what does it have to do with the underworld? The gates of death, the gates of death's shadow. What does this watery place have to do with the underworld? One interpreter was puzzled by this. What do the sources of the sea have to do with the underworld? What do they have to do with Job reaching the underworld, unless Yahweh expects him to be a scuba diver? But the point is, in the cosmic geography of the ancient world, the sources of the sea are called, that's a place where God dwells. And at that site, heaven and earth, the sea and underworld meet at the place. Okay. The four dimensions of cosmos meet at a place. The journey to the underworld begins at a place. It goes through a watery area. You reach the underworld by walking and by boat, both, right? A journey undertaken by foot, and one pass through a watery subterranean level. It takes one to the gate of the land of no return, the gate of the underworld, the gate of Sheol, the gate of the expansive underworld. So, this is the fourth dimension, and the point is that this is a place of no return. You go, you can never come back. So no one could have seen it. So Job could not have seen it because he's not died. If he had died, he wouldn't have come back. Okay. So he certainly would not have known all of it. So the structure, there are four stanzas, right, which is important. Four is symbolically important, perfection. 4 dimensions, length, breadth, height, and depth. The first two are horizontal axis, second two, vertical axis. The first couplet and last couplet frame the entire poem. And each stanza begins and ends in clearly marked ways. In other words, the entire poem is beautifully composed. And the text ends with all of it. The poem manifests Etzah. The poem itself, the poet does not just claim that there is design. By the very design of the poem, it makes a point. The world is well designed. So what? So what? So how has God answered Job? Or has God simply bullied him? First, I want to appeal to this embroidery produced following a work by Marc Chagall, Belarusian Jewish artist. In 1985, Chagall did a lot of paintings on Job. This was his final piece, his most profound piece. The tapestry, woven with a Belgian weaver, It was commissioned for a Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. And it's based on Job 14:7, for there is hope in a tree. So in this embroidery, you see Job in front holding a book, presumably the book of Job, his wife standing in comforting pose behind him. But there are 5 other readers in the image. At the bottom, you see 4 readers. 3 old men and a young man. Who are these? 3 old men and a young man reading the book of Job. Now, this refers to the 3 friends of Job and Elihu, the young man. At the top, we have an angel with Torah behind him, also reading a book. So the angel of the Lord in Jewish religion represents God. So you get Job, the reader, the 3 friends, the reader of Job, and Elihu, and God, the reader of the book of Job. But in front of Job is another reader, sitting in front of Job, holding a book. Who is this mysterious reader who's reading the book of Job with the rest? It is you, the interpreter, who's now invited to a conversation with all the other readers of the book. In the medieval philosophical interpretation of Job, unlike Christians, Jews read the book of Job not as systematic theology, but as a conversation of many voices, human voices as well as the voice of God. The book of Job is an encapsulation of a spirited conversation or valid points of view, not equal, but all valid points of view. Chagall interprets Job similarly as one of contested readings, including the deity and the reader. I love that. You're invited to conversation to interact with God and God's reading of the book of Job. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber has observed the depiction of God in the speeches, the divine speeches, we do not here have a cruel God. So there are 4 portrayals of God in the book of Job. The prologue portrays a God of questionable character, a God who presides over the suffering of the innocent man. That's one portrayal. The second portrayal is the God of Job's friends. This is a retributive God. Okay, right? And third, we have Job's God, is a God who hides his face, a God we do not understand, a God of mystery. But Yahweh is a God who relates, an I, thou God. We get 4 portrayals of Job. Buber argues that the question of divine justice is addressed through the idea of creation, by founding, setting, commanding, and appointing. God forms the earth by establishing the boundaries and limits, so everything is a set place. And so people experience divine justice in creation. The natural order, the very nature itself, is a testimony to God's justice. Not retributive justice, says Buber, but distributive justice. God distributes justice as God will. The purpose of God's cosmology is to teach Job about the place of humanity. Filmmaker Terrence Malick offers a contemplative cinematic interpretation of this passage in the book of Job in his movie The Tree of Life, which won the Palme d'Or award in 2011. The film opens with a quote from Yahweh's speech. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and the heavenly beings shouted for joy. This quote is shown for several seconds in black and white, followed by a flame that represents divine presence. In fact, light recurs throughout the film. You find light almost every frame. Light appears in front of the family's house. The film revolves around a family in Waco, Texas, the O'Brien family. So light recurs throughout the film. But at the beginning, the viewer is taken through 20 minutes of silent sequence, viewing the wonders of the cosmos. The exploration of the cosmos, the wordless sequence. Viewers witness the initial formation of galaxies, planets, and the stars. They witness the incipience of microbes and prehistoric evolution of life. And amid the ethereal splendor of creation, however, there are eruptions of violence and destruction. It's in the crashing of a large asteroid that turned the world to dust for years and led to the end of the species of creatures. And yet new life emerges, new species thrive. The creatures of the earth too sometimes manifest gratuitous cruelty, as in this scene of a dinosaur coming upon a smaller, wounded dinosaur, needlessly proceeds to step on the head of the wounded, vulnerable other. And yet, this would-be predator inexplicably hesitates and turns away from unnecessary predation. Such contradictions are among the puzzling realities of the cosmos. So the film script of Talent Malik is available. So Malik writes in the film script, how strange, she says, that a calamity and disease should lead life forward. Proof indispensable to its unfolding, that such grandeur should rise up from a foundation of pain and death and ruin. So you get these wonderful scenes of the cosmos, beautiful and sometimes terrifying. But interspersed with these sublime images of the cosmos are vignettes of the mundane life of the O'Brien family of Waco, Texas. The story unfolds mostly through flashback, viewed from perspective of the couple's oldest son, Jack O'Brien. He has initials, Jack O'Brien, J-O-B. Recalls the protagonist of the biblical book. But the mother is also a Job-like figure in her virtues. A woman so faithful, kind, and upright, says Malik, who has loved the good, given to the poor, and comforted the desolate. Theirs was a family once happy and prosperous, brought down in sorrow and doom when news came of the inexplicable death of the Jack's younger brother, R.L., aged 19. These and other uncertainties of life prompt theological questions articulated in a voiceover concerning God's purpose. You hear the sound, why? Where were you? How shall I find you again? Did you know? Who are you, God? And if you aren't good, why should we be? So you get lives of this family interspersed with this magnificent cosmology. Some movie critics really hated the movie. They thought that this intertwining of the cosmic and the mundane was a trivializing of the mundane, as if human suffering are nothing compared to the grandeur of the cosmos. Other reviewers understood the film to imply that beauty and the beneficence of creation are more decisive clues to the nature of God than human experience of suffering. And yet, the juxtaposition of the sublime and the mundane suggests that human experience, when set against the unfathomable magnitude and complexity of the cosmos, with its history that spans billions of years, was inadequate. We think the world revolves around us, but history is much more vast. The sweeping cosmology does not negate human suffering, but it sets human suffering within an infinitely larger, more complex context. In the face of the comprehensive cosmology, categories of right and wrong, or just and unjust, can only be contingent and incomplete. This too is the point of Yahweh's cosmology. So Yahweh challenges Job in spatial terms. Where were you? When? Yahweh knows about extremities of the sea and the underworld and heaven, things that we do not know. Yahweh's view is complete in time and complete in space. This is a response to Job's epistemology. Job views the entire world in human-centered terms, in egocentric terms. It begins with himself. What his ear tests, what his palate tastes, and from that to the community, and from that to larger society, and then to the larger cosmos. Human beings view the cosmos in terms of our perspective, the I perspective. God views the cosmos in terms of God's perspective. That's God's answer. You think you know all of the cosmos. Do you know the extremities of it? You do not know the entirety of the cosmos. So the point is that it's not that Job's ignorant of everything. The point is that you do not know all of it. So you are in no place to judge God for injustice. That's God's answer to Job. So we learn from Talmud Malik how to read the book of Job. Malik did his degree at Harvard in philosophy and film. And so he wanted to be a professor, went to Oxford, studied to be a professor, and then he disagreed with his preceptor, and he left Harvard to teach at MIT for 2 years. But decided that teaching was not for him, and so he decided to be a filmmaker. And he's made 5 or 6 films, all very profound. He was in Harvard in the 1960s, where he must have taken a course on the book of Job with my mentor, Frank Moore-Cross. So his reading of Job is very profound. So this film is a thoughtful, cinematic exegesis of the book of Job. It makes the point that God makes. You don't know all of it. This is not to say human suffering do not matter. They matter. But they're only one tiny part of the larger reality that God oversees. God's eye cosmology is not my eye cosmology. That is the first movement, the first response to Job. Then will come 2 more movements, which we'll cover in weeks to come. Okay, thank you. Okay, questions?
Yeah, it's open. Any one of you have any question?
So the book does not soften the problem of injustice. It doesn't soften it, but it tells us we don't know all of it. Yes? Yeah, it gives the impression of being the oldest book, right? Commerce is by way of barter, skin for sin. Home is called tent. So there are a number of suggestions that is very old, and when Job, at the end of it, Job lived 140 years, beyond, which maybe 210 years total. It gives the impression of being very old, but that is only the setting of the book. The origin of the book is something else. As I pointed out, there's a mention of Sabaeans, so there's no superscription, no historical data, no clues of history. All we have is circumstantial evidence. And this includes the Sabaeans, who were not in Tema before 700 BCE. So the earliest date possible is 700 BCE. It mentioned Chaldeans, who were like robbers, raiders. The only time the Chaldeans behaved that way, around Tema, was between 543 and 553 and 543. So the earliest date then based on that, is mid-6th century. At one point, Job mentions in chapter 19, verse 21 or 23, he says, I wish that what I would say would be written on an inscription with chisel, with iron and with lead, meaning lead inlay. There's only one inscription in the ancient world where inscriptions have lead inlay to make it permanent. That was established in the year 515 by Darius I of Persia. It was well known. It circulated in copies in Akkadian tablets and Aramaic papyri. Famous. So that's a datum. There's the only inscription like that. The dates can be no earlier than 515. If we compare the language of Job, so even though parts of the language sound very old, there are parts of it that don't quite sound so old. So scholars talk about linguistic typology. Linguistic typology is like this. Suppose I come to you and say, they found a new play by Shakespeare. And this new wonderful play, the queen says to the king, Your Majesty, thou art a very cool cat. Now Shakespeare said that. There's no history of the English language. Suppose the queen goes on to say, and thy friends are really cool dudes. Those are linguistic clues, right? So if the play has language like that, you can date it to 1970s. So we have linguistic clues. Based on linguistic clues, the book of Job is written in part in late biblical Hebrew, between 6th century and 5th century. Fits the other data. And if you compare the language of Job with other parts of the Bible, it matches Jeremiah, Lamentation, and Isaiah 40 to 55, right? But not Isaiah 46 to 56 to 66, which dates to about 450. So the book of Job probably was written between 515 and 400. Which is why the Persian dating is the Persian period. That's not unimportant. The problem with the Persian period was the danger of dualism. The Persians believed in a God of good and a God of evil. Good God and bad God. Biblical writers in that period insist on one God. Earlier writers did not insist on that. Earlier writers spoke of worshipping one God. You have no other God before me, but the other gods exist. In the Persian period, however, there's only one God. And you get this monotheism in the book of Job. So it gives the impression of being very, very old and far away, right? But it's not very old and it's not far away, because the traditions they interact with are Deuteronomy, Genesis, right? Yahweh is called Yahweh, at least in the prose. So it's not far away and not very old. Written in Israel between 515 and I would say 450, but let's make it 400 just to be sure, in the period. And that context is important because in the period, biblical writers say, God is the one who created light and darkness, real and woe, good and evil. They all come from only one God. As the Persians thought there were two gods. See? So the context is important because Job is staunchly monotheistic, only one God, and it occurs a few times in the book. There's only one God. Yeah. Okay. I'm also happy to share the slides. If you want, I'm happy to make you copy the slides for you. Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides, provided you don't circulate it, because it's part of my coming book. So I'm happy to share the slides so you can view it on your own. How do I do that? How can I share the slides? You can just come forward and I'll let you copy. Yeah, maybe Reverend Leong can help with that. Yeah, so I'm happy to share the slides, or I should share all the slides. Okay? There's a lot. I think commentators tend to gloss over the problem. And I want to look closely at the book of Job, how it takes seriously the problem of divine injustice, and how God really answers Job. Yes?
Thank you for your lecture. Actually, it's very interesting in your explanation that God is really in control of the earth, the sky, the heavens, and the Netherlands, is it?
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, it's very profound. But how can we use this to comfort the person who is really suffering or in pain? You can tell them, God is in charge of the whole world and all that. But, when you're in pain, all they can think about is their ego and what they're suffering now. So can you give us some suggestion?
Yeah. So one of the peculiar things about Job is that God does not address the problems of why people suffer. The book of Job is often characterized as theodicy, a defense of God's justice. This was a dominant view until the 17th century. In the late 16th century, the French rationalists were arguing that the world, given the dominance of evil, given the problems in the world, you can no longer believe in a good God. So in 1710, the German polymath Leibniz wrote an essay in French to answer the French rationalists entitled Theodicy. He took the term theodicy from two Greek words, God and justice, arguing that the book of Job, the world is not without, the world is imperfect. There are many imperfections, right? But the world is as good as it ought to be. It's the optimum. So this was the view that scholars began to propound. Alexander Pope, next lecture, I'm talking about that. The world is as good as it gets. Then in 1753, a devastating earthquake leveled down Lisbon. The church, on All Saints' Day, the cathedral in Lisbon was leveled. From then on, people could no longer simply defend the justice of God. Theodicy, from that on, as in Rousseau and Voltaire, was chastened theodicy. You no longer defend God. The book of Job does not defend the justice of God. It accepts the problem and gives no answer. Elihu tries to answer it and goes to a large extent by saying that there's no one solution. You cannot say suffering is always a result of sin and punishment. But Elihu's answers were not complete. And then God does not answer the question. So I argue that the book of Job is not a theodicy, it sidesteps the issue. So I don't think it's our place to ever explain to people why they suffer. We say we don't know. We don't. Sometimes there are explanations, right? One explanation, for instance, is that God inflicts pain as a pedagogy. C.S. Lewis thought that. C.S. Lewis, when his mother suffered, says, his mother's suffering, this is God's megaphone. God is teaching us that the sickness is God's message. That's a terrible view. My wife struggled with cancer for 20 years. Don't tell me that this is God's megaphone. C.S. Lewis, as it turned out later on, when his wife was dying, changed his mind. He no longer held the view. The book of Job does not explain suffering. It tells us sometimes suffering has no explanation. And I would say, when people are suffering, don't give answers. Just be there. I tell my students especially, you are not being pastoral when you give answers. Don't give answers. Be there in silence and comfort. And say God is far larger than our explanations. Let God be God. God does not address the problem of suffering at all. God basically addressed the problem of who we are. We do not know. So, yes, I would not try to address. The theologian Gutierrez says the book of Job is not about suffering. It's not about why people suffer. It gives no explanation. It's about how you talk about God in the face of innocent suffering. How you talk about God in the face of innocent suffering. The book of Job is atheodic. It does not defend the justice of God. In fact, we have theologians now who argue, in light of the Holocaust, a defense of God is evil, says one theologian. Don't prop up the rock of salvation. God does not need our props. Let's just cry with sufferers before God. So I would say, don't try to give us explanation. The friends try to explain, and you all fail. And Elihu, to his credit, does not do that. See, there are many reasons, sometimes we just don't know. But Elihu makes the point then, but God takes every excuse, every possibility to reach out to us in grace. I'll think it to be a message of Job. Yes. Yes.
So in Job, there's a verse, paraphrasing is, the Lord giveth and he taketh away. So for us, just ordinary students, we remember this verse. Are there any more profound verses that we can learn? Thank you.
So ask you to be patient. We're going to reach something interesting at the end. Okay, so be patient. I'm going to build up. There's this build up. Okay, there's a build up to the epilogue. The epilogue is going to make us look back. So don't force me to give answers now. Let's wait till the end. Okay. Yeah. Akan datang. Let's wait. I take seriously Luis Alonso Shoko's point. The book of Job is not just meant to be read, it's meant to be experienced. 42 chapters we go over with agony and share Job's anger at the lack of solution. See, all of which to lead us to the end. Then we really understand we get to the end. You must take the time to experience the pain of the book of Job. Yeah, so wait for the epilogue. Huh? There'll be a lot I have to say on the epilogue, which is going to be in Seremban, by the way. March 18, I think. March 18, Seremban.
So, Dr. Seow, you were mentioning that Job was feeling powerless. Other than the question of injustice, I think I was just wondering about hope, because the rhetoric effect of the text that we saw today, I imagine would make Job feel even more powerless and even more small.
Yes.
Would you have anything more to say about
it? So
it?
this is only first part. First part of the first speech. There will be two other parts to coming that will add a lot more to what we'll be doing. And again, the difference between Christians and Jews. Christians read the book of Job as systematic theology. Job was the most important book in the Old Testament for Jews, for Christians in the Old Testament. The most important. And every year they read from the book of Job because it's all about Christ. Jews never read it that way. Jews read it as a rigorous, contested conversation in which God participates. See? And Jews, in fact, thought that Elihu gives the best answer to the problem of suffering, which is true, because God does not address the issue. But Elihu, like Elijah, prepares the way for God to give an answer. So, yes, we can read it with hopelessness. And Job hope is the key theme in Job. Job, when hope is gone, everything is gone. See? But Job's entire view is human-centered. He is the image of God. Human beings are the image of God. And God is going to tweak that theology. To what extent are we the image of God? God is going to tweak that theology. So it doesn't deny that loss of hope is a problem. For Job, life is meaningless if there's no hope. The word for hope is also the word for thread. So Job's life is like a weave. See, when the thread is gone, when hope is gone, it is the end. See? So for Job, the loss of hope is a problem, and God's going to come back and address that.
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm looking back on when Job was struck down with a sickness, and then his wife says, like, how can you love God after all he's done?
Slow down, I can hear.
Sorry, I'll slow down. When Job gets struck down with his sickness, and like he's lost all his family, his wife comes back in when he's mourning, and she says, how can you still be faithful and trust God after all that he's done? Then later on, his friends come back, and then they try and convince him that Job must have done something wrong for God's punishment, you know. So in that sentence, on those passages, is Job being accused of being hubris? And then, you know, do you understand what I mean by hubris?
Yes.
Yeah.
Job's hubris?
Yes, and
Yeah.
therefore his friends think Job is
Yeah.
being hubris, therefore he's getting punished, like God's punishing him for
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
then later on, when God answers him, he's almost saying that as well,
Yeah.
like you're being too prideful, you know,
Yeah.
who are you to question me?
Yeah. So the first speech, well, again, the whole end is going to build up. So first speech is basically challenge Job's human-centered theology, challenge the idea of what it means to be the image of God. Then the second speech is going to be about God as the one who oversees good and evil. The epilogue is going to come back and talk about what the problem is. The problem is not the problem. I don't want to get to the problem are with people who do not address the problem of divine justice, who cover it up. Because those who cover it up, see, are the ones who deserve condemnation. Those like Job, who speaks outright to God about God's injustice, he is a servant of God. Whereas those who cover it up, see, deserve condemnation. You don't cover up injustice, even when there's no explanation. So this is challenge of hubris from a number of different perspectives. Right? So Job is not, in the end, God says Job is right. Job is not condemned for his anger. He's condemned for not knowing it all. The friends are condemned for not speaking truthfully about God. The book of Job, as a friend of mine argued, the book of Job is about truth-telling. This is what Gutierrez, the book of Job is about honest theology, truth-telling, calling God on the carpet, standing alongside those who suffer to protest. And those who do not do so are endangering community. The epilogue makes the point. Yeah. So don't rush to the conclusion yet, okay? I want us to unpack the conclusion slowly, because there's a lot there. Next lesson is going to be key. Chapter 38, the next section here on meteorology is going to be the key, because it centers the only time it mentions human beings. Okay? In the entire speech, it's right at the center, where it says God brings rain upon land of place, and no human being is there whatsoever. Creation is not about you. Creation is about God's graciousness. I think the second speech is going to be key in many ways, the high point of theology of the book of Job. So I'm going to argue next time.
I think we're at time. Just a quick announcement before I let our pastor close. For those of you who are interested in the slides, you can come and see Jason. This is Jason from STM, the seminary, so you can come and see him. And if you want to know the rest of the other dates and the themes that we will cover, there's a poster on the notice board, and you can take a photo of it. The next few venues and dates are on the poster.
So if you need my slides, Ian or Reverend Leong will have my slides. I'm free to share, yeah. But don't distribute them, because my publisher will sue me.
Yeah, we want to thank Dr. Seow for the lecture. I think today we are not just receiving information. I think it gave us a framework for us to actually to ponder, to wonder, to think actually further. Well, I find it very helpful. It helps us to see the cosmos. Of course, when we talk about cosmos or when we hear about cosmology, often we think about the distant galaxy. Perhaps people when first talk about the cosmology, you see. But I think today help us to see it is about how do we understand cosmos and the order. I think more importantly, above all, I think to understand the reality. I think the meaning itself of cosmos, cosmology, I think that is very valuable. Perhaps I think in our hearts we still have a lot of questions to ask. I'm not sure how many of us are patient enough to wait. There are five more, is it 5 or 6 more lessons to go. And of course, for those who are interested to continue to follow, the next session, public lecture will be on the 28th of February, Saturday, 2 to 4 p.m. Actually, it will be located in KL Chinese Methodist Church. Yeah, it's on the 28th of February from 2 to 4. It's actually a Saturday. And the theme is actually green theology. And if you want to know more, of course, like Pastor Ian mentioned, actually at the back there, we already put there the dates and the location. You can always follow that. And of course, I think under STM, they will actually post it in the YouTube as well. And we're able to follow the teaching as well, yeah. And for the rest of the lecture, I think they will be do live stream. You were unable to go there, unfortunately, then you can always follow the live stream, right? I think that's about all for today. A lot of things that we can ponder. Perhaps that's where we go back and digest. As you attend the next session, perhaps you can have more to ask. Yeah, let's have a closing prayer before we depart from here. Come, let's pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord Jesus, Lord, that you are the creator of heaven and earth, the one who spoke and the galaxy came into being, who set the stars in their course, and yet know each of us by name, Lord. We thank you, Lord, for this time of learning and a time for reflection. We thank you for the insight that we have received through Dr. Seow and helping us to have a glimpse of the vastness of the cosmos and, of course, the depth of wisdom woven into your creation. Lord, as we contemplate the immensity of the universe, guard our hearts from pride, teach us about humility, that the more we know, the more we marvel, and the more we marvel, the more, Lord, we worship you. Lord, remind us, Lord, through this, that beyond that equation and theories, behind time and behind space, stands the living God who sustains all things by the word of your power. Lord, we ask, Lord, may this knowledge not just end in fascination alone, but lead us, guide us into your reverence, to faith, and to a deeper trust in you and you alone, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Therefore, as we depart from here, Lord, send us forth with mind enlightened, hearts anchored in truth, and lives aligned with your purposes, that we may steward this world wisely and walk humbly before you, Lord. We commit all that we have heard, all that we have learned in your hand, and may your Spirit continue to guide us into all truth. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, we pray. Amen. Once again, thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here, and may God bless you. See you again. Bye-bye.